Good morning, everyone. My name is Carlos Mendez. I'm a EPRC director. Welcome to our fourth and final EPRC webinar of this spring series. Today we welcome James Wilson from Orkestra-Basque Institute of Competitiveness, who will present on the topic of policy mixes for new place-based innovation policies. The presentation will last around 30 minutes or so, followed by a discussion and questions and answers. If at that stage you want to make an intervention, please just raise your hand or post a question on the chat, and we'll address these in the Q&A session. The webinar is being recorded to allow you to follow at a later stage. This will be shared on our own EPRC YouTube channel as well, and by email to the list. So let me present our speaker today. James Wilson is General Director at Orkestra-Basque Institute of Competitiveness, linked to the Deusto Business School at the University of Deusto. His research is focused on regional competitiveness, clusters, governance, regional strategy, and the roles of universities in territorial development. James has over 20 years experience working on policy analysis, working with governments and institutions at different levels, and has edited numerous policy reports, including the annual Basque Competitiveness Report. He's published widely in academic journals and books, and has also led European research projects. So over to you, James, if you'd like to share your slides.
Thanks very much, Carlos. Good morning, everyone. Let me just share slides if that's working. Yeah, that seems to be working. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning and to share some ideas on research that we've been working on. I've been working on with colleagues at Orkestra and elsewhere over, well, quite a few years now. The idea, I guess, of today's session is to get, just see if I can move forward these slides, is to talk to the overall question of how can we build effective transformative innovation policy from regions. I think is the kind of question I want to talk about, and starting from the premise that whereas there's been a lot of discourse around the need for transformative innovation policy, when it comes to building it from the ground, there's quite a big or large implementation gap. And I think that's our overall starting point. The invitation to participate in the seminar series, which was much appreciated, and as I say, great to be able to share these ideas with you, came from Liliana a couple of months ago when she saw that Edurne Magro and myself had published a book chapter on policy mixes for new place innovation policies. So that book chapter was published in the new role. The State for Transformative Innovation Handbook by Edward Elgar about 2 or 3 months ago. But really, we wrote that book chapter more like 3 years ago. So our research has kind of moved on a bit since then. So what I wanted to do was, rather than simply talk about the book chapter, which I will do a little bit because I think the ideas are very relevant, but also to share with you some ongoing research that's come out of that line. Okay, so what we're doing now, opposed to what we were doing 3 years ago when we wrote the book chapter. So we'll talk first of all about the key ideas from the chapter, and then combine that with sharing some ongoing research that Edurne and myself, together with Ainhoa Arona, another colleague at Orkestra, and colleagues from the JRC in Seville, Christian Matti and Carol Hageman, we're working at the moment on a really, I think, interesting project that focuses on the governance of implementation of industrial transitions in regional contexts. So I want to kind of take forward our initial ideas from the book chapter and share with you some of the things we're working on, again using cases from the examples from the Basque Country to illustrate what we're working on with that. Okay, you move forward again. So when it comes to a kind of, I guess, a starting point for this, I think that the starting point that we went back to when we started working on the chapter, and it kind of is recurring in our continual work today, is this idea that there is a convergence of industrial innovation policy around a much more strategic approach. The narratives of injecting directionality into innovation policy have become ever present over the last 5 or 6 years, in particular in the context of the big societal challenges that we're facing. And we see that both in academic discourse and in policy discourse. But what's particularly interesting is that I think that has led to a kind of convergence between industrial policy and innovation policy fields. So if we look at how literature has evolved in industrial policy, we've seen over the last 20 years or so a kind of move from thinking about old industrial policy, which was kind of rejected in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s. And it's kind of resurged with this idea of a new industrial policy via largely the concept of Danny Roderick and Ricardo Hausmann's concept of discovery, the idea that new industrial policy should be able to target specific activities, but it should do so through a process of discovery. So rather than being government-centric, it should be involve different stakeholders in identifying which activities to prioritize. So industrial policy has taken a much more strategic role in our debates today, and both at European level and at member state level and at regional level, we see much more acceptance today around the role that industrial policy should be playing. At the same time, in parallel, there's been an evolution of innovation policy from kind of more linear conceptions of innovation to systemic conceptions throughout the late 80s into the 90s, and much more recently, over the last decade, into this concept of transformative innovation, which includes, I think, the smart specialization strategy paradigm. And the idea there being that innovation policy should try to have some form of directionality. It should seek to transform beyond a merely economic imperative. So we've got this kind of parallel evolution of what are traditionally different policy domains, and I think a lot of the messiness we see in policy analysis comes about because we have these two different streams that, in some sense, have converged around a more strategic approach, and that has happened in the context of this need to respond to societal challenges. So we see emergence of literature around missions, around sustainability transitions, the Sustainable Development Goals, concept of Industry 5.0 are all kind of different ways of talking about the idea that when we're thinking about economic development, and whether that's place-based or not place-based, we should be thinking about it in ways that intersect with other challenges that society faces. So that kind of more strategic context has led, I think, or has evolved in parallel with the evolution of these two policy domains. So that's, I think, our conceptual starting point for the analysis, both in the book chapter and our current ongoing research. So thinking about innovation policy, then I think it's widely acknowledged today that there's a need to broaden innovation from its traditional economic focus. The assumption being that innovation is at the heart of radical societal change. So if we want to address our pressing challenges, whether they be demographic or climate related, then we need to innovate in order to do so. So that puts a different slant on the need for innovation from a purely economic rationale. And that has been, I think, in the literature at least, and also in policy understanding, that has led to two main streams of thought. On the one hand, we have the kind of mission-oriented innovation policies, thinking led by Mariana Mazzucato, which has been very influential, for example, in shaping the European Union's Horizon program, the current research program. And on the other hand, we have the transformative innovation policy stream, kind of developed by Weber and Rorach, Scott and Steinmuller, etc., and others, which has been heavily influenced by literature on sustainability transitions and on how the economic dimension of innovation needs to support, in a sense, those sustainability transitions. So we have this need to broaden innovation, but, and this is, I think, our starting point really in terms of practice, there's an implementation gap. And that's the issue that we want to try, or that we're trying to explore with our ongoing research on this. There's a real, I think, lack of understanding around how the policy mixes for addressing transformative change are best articulated across different actors and places. And the types of questions that emerge is, how should different actors be engaged? When should different actors be engaged? which failures or which issues need to be addressed at national level, which at subnational level, which at supranational level, and what type of coordination is required between the different territorial levels. So there's a whole series of issues which come down, in a sense, to coordination or governance, which are critical for understanding how we move from a general idea that we need to broaden innovation and we need to have mission-oriented policies or transformative innovation policies, to actually making them work on the ground, and taking into account the complexity of different territorial scales for doing so. In that sense, I think that it's fair to say there's a kind of unresolved role for place in much of the academic and policy discourse around transformative innovation. I think these both the mission-oriented and the transformative innovation streams started off very much from a national or supranational orientation, a very kind of top-down approach, but they have, been criticised and I think quickly have generated acknowledgement that actually place-based policy must play a key role also in these processes. So, but there's a kind of a tension around that. We know that societal challenges manifest themselves differently in different places. So if we look at climate challenges, for example, are very different in a region like where I am in the Basque Country to, say, a region in the centre of Spain, which has very different both issues from climate in terms of heat versus flooding, for example, but also very different industrial structures and contributions to climate challenges. So the societal challenges that we're facing in the Basque Country are quite different to those in Extremadura or other regions in the centre of Spain. Kieran Flanagan and others have argued that in order to get beyond that, we need a very sophisticated understanding of place to be built into this policy discourse that incorporates productive structure, but also goes beyond productive structure to appreciate values, social assets, cultures, how problems are framed, etc. But they also argue that it's also important to avoid unrealistic expectations that regions can simply act like mini nation states. They don't have the same capacity, competences to be able to develop missions, for example, or to be able to push forward transformative innovation policy as nation states or as the European level. So they argue in that really interesting paper for a kind of middle ground understanding. We need to appreciate the role of place, but we also need to appreciate how the role of place fits within multi-level context. So if we think about the regional level and how literature on analysis of regional innovation has evolved, regional innovation systems is perhaps the key concept that's framed regional innovation policy over the last several decades now. But it's been very much oriented towards technological innovation and economic growth. So it hasn't only recently started to move beyond that and embrace perhaps a broader view of innovation. And it could be argued, I think, that smart specialization strategies at least attempts to take a step beyond innovation and economic growth, experimenting with directionality failures to a certain extent at regional scale. So if we look at the S3 concept, it has three key characteristics which I think make it very interesting in terms of a regional experiment with transformative innovation policy. First of all, it's very clearly context and capability specific. Its starting point is the regional context and the regional policy capabilities. Secondly, it's explicitly oriented to targeting transformation, economic transformation, usually in the nexus between innovation and industrial policy, but also there has certainly been in the kind of in the latest iteration of S3 much more talk about how economic transformation needs to combine with environmental transformation, social transformation. So there is more of a directionality seeping into the smart specialization strategy discourse. And thirdly, it is organized or oriented through a process of discovery as a means of determining directionality. The idea being that places should discover their strategies and discover how they should implement those strategies through interactive engagement amongst policymakers, business, university research and civil society. So we have this kind of new paradigm of engagement at the heart of the smart specialization strategy approach. So that again gives a much more clear role for place, because that type of engagement takes place at regional scale or at sub-regional scale even, often much more effectively than it does at national or supranational scale. So in the book chapter, what we try to do, building on that context, is to use the typology developed by Weber and Rohracher of different policy rationales in transformative system failures as a basis for exploring examples of multi-level policy mixes in different regional contexts. And we use the Basque, Catalan, and Welsh context because these are places where we have at the time we had been working on recent research projects and had an understanding of specific initiatives in those contexts. So what we tried to do was to systematically go through the 4 transformative system failures identified by Weber and Rohracher: directionality, coordination, reflexivity, and demand articulation. And then to try to look at different initiatives in these 3 cases, and these are 3 cases of regions that have strong regional identity. They're industrial regions with decarbonisation challenges, and they have significant regional level policy competences. So there's certain similarities between the 3 cases. I'm not going to go into detail about the initiatives that we looked at because that's in the chapter, and also I think it's more interesting to talk a little bit further about the ongoing research. But what we came to was a kind of summary table which essentially tried to break down our analysis into the policy mix components, drawing on work by Roger and Reichard and Kivmer and Kern, and then kind of cross-referencing those policy mix components, strategic vision, processes, and instruments with the different categories of transformative failure, and trying to position the examples in those. So if we start with directionality, for example, we can see directionality has implications for strategic vision, for processes, and for instruments. And in fact, if we want to promote directionality within an innovation policy context, there are different ways of doing it. We can do it in terms of a strategic visioning and understanding about the need for directionality. We can look at soft instruments that try to shape processes, things like cluster policies, for example, that try to build certain capacities and shape processes. And then we can look at more concrete instruments or hard instruments such as fiscal instruments or regulations that try to force or shape directionality. As we move down strategic vision into processes and instruments, we find that directionality tends to come together with some of the other transformative failures: coordination, reflexivity in the case of processes, demand articulation in the case of instruments, and coordination again. And what we did essentially was to try and position our examples and discuss our examples in the context of those different policy mix components. What emerged from that? Well, in terms of key conclusions, first of all, we kind of, our discussion of these different cases really underscored the need for a very sophisticated articulation across levels. When policies are implemented in one of the regional scales, they inevitably interact with policies at the national and the EU scale, and that requires a strong articulation. Also, the need for effective implementation on the ground, and which is related in a sense to the articulation. It's not simply a case of envisaging policy, but it's how the process of doing policy in practice then interacts with other policy levels, etc. The key role for subnational levels. Again, in all the different cases, we saw how the subnational level was central in terms of enabling that articulation, but with vertical governance challenges, tensions often between the local level, the regional level, and then perhaps the national level or the EU level. We also noted when looking at the examples that these policies don't start from scratch. It's an evolutionary process. Often what happens is that policy approaches that seek to be transformative at regional level add transformative dimensions to existing policies. So we take, for example, we looked at the Catalan cluster policy, for example, as one of the cases, and we see there an evolution from a fairly traditional cluster policy, which is oriented towards economic competitiveness, to attempt to infuse it with the concept of shared value and the idea that business competitiveness can contribute both to the bottom line of the business and to broader social goals. And so there were, it was a policy that has evolved, and so you get a kind of layering where you're adding transformative dimensions to existing policies, and that has consequences also for the interaction across levels. It's not simply creating new policies. We also were very aware when looking at this of the multi-domain perspective and the possible trade-offs that come about through that. The idea that often the challenges that we're trying to address through transformative innovation policy need interaction between, say, innovation policy and health policy, or innovation policy and environmental policy, and that often doesn't always work so smoothly within governments, particularly when you're talking about governments at different levels. And finally, we highlight the need to understand the time dimension. And this is a bit related to the evolutionary process, but the idea that you have different combinations of policies, different combinations of actors at different moments in time. So all of this that's how we concluded the book chapter, but it all points to the need to understand more about how we govern the implementation process. So it's not just about putting in place policies or policy mixes, but it's about how their implementation actually takes place on the ground and is governed in terms of the coordination across actors as it takes place. And so that's led us into, if you like, our ongoing research agenda, which is trying to understand in more depth these issues of governance and implementation. Just check the watch. So what we've, kind of three things to note here. First of all, as I said, the book chapter we wrote, I guess, around 3 years ago now, and reading back through it over the last few days, we noticed that there has been a change in context and a change in framing of some of these issues. There's a much stronger framing today in the European policy debate around economic resilience in the face of geopolitical uncertainties. So the economic dimension has come back more strongly, I think, in the debates today, and that's framing things much more in terms of, well, how does our industry within regions maintain its resilience while simultaneously addressing societal challenges. So there's been a slight shift in how some of these debates are framed. And in terms of our research agenda, that's led us to think a little bit differently. Yes, we wanted to look at the role of governance for implementing transformative innovation policies, but what we're really trying to focus that on at the moment is in place-based industrial transitions. So how do our industries transform themselves in ways that maintain their competitiveness and their capability of providing well-being for the populations that live in our regions, whilst at the same time transforming towards, for example, environmental challenges or embracing demographic challenges, etc. In terms of that research agenda, one of the things that we're trying to do at the moment is look beyond the policy mix concept, certainly as it's traditionally understood, and look towards what we're calling at the moment innovation portfolios of projects and activities led by different actors. Because one of the things we see in the book chapter and then in our research following that is that it's not simply a mix of policies as traditionally understood as in public sector-led policies. We're talking here about innovation projects or innovation initiatives that are being led by lots of different actors within a region. And the real challenge is, how do you bring together an innovation portfolio of different activities and give it directionality and govern it in a way that will take it in a specific direction? So there's a portfolio management challenge which requires intermediation of some description. And there we're kind of looking at different types of governance: administrative, network-based, society-based governance, following Jansen's typology. We're also looking at the concept of meta-governance and the role that perhaps regional administrations play and other actors or other intermediaries within regions play in terms of bringing together different governances under one umbrella. And the overall kind of question we're trying to get at is, which governance arrangements do we need for the strategic direction, coherence and effectiveness of a portfolio of projects and activities within a region that will take us in a transformative direction? To do that, we're exploring cases within the Basque Country, which cases that we know best, because Orkestra is a research institute that works closely with different actors within the region to try and understand their challenges. So we're trying to zoom in on that expertise and look at specific cases here that rely on different portfolios of actors and activities. For those of you who don't know much about the Basque Country, just a very quick summary to give some background. You can see there where we are on the map, a small population of around 2 million. Most policy competences are independent of Spain, so it's a region with very strong policy competences, but it has a very complex multi-level administrative structure. So, for example, we have 3 provincial councils beneath the regional level, which are responsible for tax collection. So the regional level itself has a level below that has particular strength. There's a high presence of cooperative businesses and a strong culture of public-private cooperation, which builds out of that cooperative mindset. There's also been, over the last 4 decades at least, a strong and balanced economic and social development. So it's a region that has been relatively successful and has been recognised in sense as a long-term success case in territorial strategy making by different people. So, however, it's also a region that is facing significant challenges at the moment, significant challenges related to a heavily energy-intensive industrial structure, which gives it particular environmental challenges, and also related to highly aging demographic. So it's a region of Spain that has, until very recently, not had flows of immigration. That combined with low birth rates means that we have one of the highest aging rates in the whole of Europe. And immigration has started to flow very recently, so we're also having challenges of integration of different populations in terms of workforce, etc. So there is a series of challenges which are really facing and putting tension on that model that has been successful certainly over the last few decades, but is now starting to be questioned in some sense. One of the new policy initiatives that's come online over the last year, and which we are framing the cases that we're looking at, is the new industrial strategy. This is an industrial strategy that was launched about a year ago, which builds 3 main pillars, looking to generate more industry, better industry, and fewer emissions. But what's really interesting, I mean, you can see there the types of priorities. 15 priorities within the policy are relatively standard, and there's nothing hugely different. What's really different, I think, is the way of addressing them. The policy has taken an approach of trying to develop what they call transformative projects in different sectors, existing sectors in which we want to win, high growth sectors in which we want to grow, and also specific projects where we can take a leap forwards in terms of competitiveness. And the notion of these transformative projects are strong public-private or private-public cooperative projects that are financed both from the private and the public sector, and the idea is to develop a suite of these projects over the coming years, over the life of the plan, which can be managed in the sense of a kind of innovation portfolio. So to date, there are 5 projects launched. The picture just put up there was from yesterday, in fact, where this plan held its first industry forum, which brought together the leaders of the different projects, both existing and potential, together with policymakers from different levels, academic leaders, technology leaders, etc. So there's a governance also related to this, which I think is quite interesting, and we're looking forward to exploring how it evolves over the course of the strategy. Getting to the examples that we're working on at the moment, and this is a paper in process together with colleagues at the JRC, we're looking at 3 examples of innovation portfolios. These are kind of portfolios of different activities that are brought together under different governance arrangements, and we're looking at the governance arrangements. So the first of these is the Net Zero Basque Supercluster. This is an initiative that's been running for about 4 years now. It's heavily research, innovation, technology driven. It's mission oriented in the sense that it's oriented towards decarbonisation explicitly. deliberate and long term, and it adopts a kind of network governance approach, which I'll explain in more detail in a moment. Essentially, it's a public-private strategic alliance with regional agency, providing a kind of meta-governance and very high institutional density. I won't talk about the other two examples in detail, but just to give you a flavour for them, Mobil is a mobility innovation platform at one of the sub-regional levels, the province of Gipuzkoa. Again, it's mission-oriented towards sustainability, but its real feature here is the multi-level governance. There we're looking in detail at how governance takes place across levels, because although it's a sub-regional level which is coordinating this, it has very strong coordination with the regional level and also with the municipal level. And then we have BSky with the talent, which is a portfolio of projects, often largely private sector led, but the coordination of that portfolio of projects is led from the regional government of BSky. And this is associated with the talent development challenge, so it's more of a society-based challenge. It's also been more emergent with a capacity building focus, but again building on a network governance. So we're at the moment exploring these three cases with the aim of writing a paper on them, or papers on these cases. And just to give you a flavour of the Basque Industrial Supercluster, which is perhaps the one that we have most advanced in terms of our research at the moment, this is an initiative that brings together the 5 cluster organisations in the Basque Country that account for around 70% of CO2 emissions. So oil refining, steel, pulp and paper, cement and foundry account for 68% of emissions, of industrial emissions in the Basque Country. So from the 17 clusters, this project or this initiative focuses on 5 of the cluster organisations. It brings them together with public-private leadership from the Regional Development Agency, SPRI, together with 2 key energy firms, Petronor in the oil and gas industry, Iberdrola in the electricity industry. It has technological projects and partners with the technology centres, and it also has an international dimension in terms of working together with the World Economic Forum's transitioning industrial clusters towards net zero initiative. The real, I think, novelty about this is the bringing together of demand and supply across across the coordination of a large number of actors, because you have the leadership from large firms, large internationally influential firms, and the regional government, and they are combining with 5 intermediary organisations, which allow a capillarity to the whole value chain in those 5 clusters. Well, this briefly describes the governance. That again, I won't go into detail. This is a more kind of institutionalized view of the governance. What we're trying to do in the paper is conceptualize this more in terms of the innovation portfolios concept. So a first approximation is to kind of draw a diagram. This our colleague Christian Matti at JRC is great with these diagrams, and through discussions we've had around the case, he's come up with this diagram in which we're trying to articulate the bringing together of different activities under a governance and how that can generate an innovation portfolio that can move the ecosystem in a concrete direction. And our idea is to draw similar diagrams for the other cases, both here and in other places that Christian and colleagues are looking at, so that we can try and take forward this concept of innovation portfolios as a way forward. So just to conclude, and I think just spot on time more or less, key messages and research practice agenda that come out of this. First of all, 2 key messages really. First of all, the regional scale is critical if we want to address this implementation gap, but we must be aware of the regional policy competences and capacities and how they fit with other levels. So you can't look at the regional level in isolation. Secondly, we need to look beyond policy mixes, or at least static and public-centred policy mixes. Industrial transformation actually results from multiple activities and projects led by a wide range of regional actors. And so what really is key is to understand how those portfolios of activities are governed. And that implies a key role for intermediaries. We've seen in the net zero case, the cluster organisation is playing a key role. But it also, I think, implies a key role for us as social scientists. The type of research that we're doing here and that others are doing in other places, I think, can play an important role in helping to understand the governance, and also not just to understand, but actually to strengthen the governance of these portfolios of innovation activities. So to include completely experimentation and learning, I think, from a range of different experiences will be the key to the next part of this agenda in bridging the implementation gap. And with that in mind, hopefully there'll be some interesting discussion ideas and perhaps cases from other places that will come out now in the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thanks, James. Yeah, that was a really fascinating presentation on policy mixes. You shared a book chapter and also more recent JRC research that you're doing, and stressing in particular this issue of an implementation gap, policy effectiveness. And I think at the core of your presentation was the importance of governance. So you set the scene with industrial and innovation policy and how they're converging around strategic and more transformative approaches, the different factors that shape implementation and effectiveness, but also very usefully these Basque examples showing how some of these ideas are playing out in practice. From net zero, geopolitical, economic resilience challenges. You also mentioned some mobility innovation and talent development examples in this new industrial strategy with a suite of different projects and portfolios. Okay, we do have time for questions and answers. Also, as James said, any reflections you may have on your own experiences. We do have a mix of policy government actors and academics. Who would like to kick off with a question? Please do introduce yourself before asking a question or making an observation. While everybody is thinking of a question, let me come in. We do have a couple, but I've started. You mentioned the role of regions as being critical. In particular, also one of the factors was vertical governance. In practical terms, what should regions prioritize doing themselves? Of course, it depends on regional competencies, and where do they most need support from and alignment from different levels, the national and EU levels? Let me come in with another question from Liliana, so we can take a couple. Liliana.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, James. That was very interesting, and I look forward to how your research develops as well on this. I had, I suppose, two questions. One of them is just, well, you mentioned meta governance, and I was quite curious about how that would be implemented. Like, what does it look like concretely in like the regional context? Who would perform this role? And yeah, another one that I had is simply this idea, in terms of the vertical governance as well that Carlos already highlighted. But I think the Basque country is quite a good example of institutional capacity, at least that I've seen in terms of innovation. But there might be other regions that have weaker institutional capacity. So how could they implement this policy mix in that case? Maybe this is an unfair question, as you've just mainly focused now on this case, but wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Okay. Shall I try and answer those questions, Carlos?
Please do.
Okay. Well, in terms of the what should regions do themselves and what should other levels do, I do think it depends an awful lot on the context. There's no standard answer to that, because each region has different competences and capabilities. But there are certain kind of dimensions where you can draw certain things. So if we're looking at, in the ambit of regulation, for example, regulation is something that regions typically don't have the capacity to do. So if you're talking about environmental regulations, for example, which often shape the transition, certainly in terms of environmental transitions, they're typically at European level or national level, and without regions having much say. The Basque Country for example, has developed its own new Green Deal with certain regulations at regional level that fit within the national and EU regulations, or that in some sense synergize with them. But they have to look to the higher levels for those regulation-based solutions. However, when it comes to things like tax policies, etc., obviously it also depends on whether you have competences or not. Regions that have competences in tax policies can obviously do more when it comes to concrete policies. But there's a whole area of softer policy, engagement, collaboration, collaborative dynamics, etc. Cluster policy being perhaps the classic example, where the regional level is far more effective than the national or higher levels, because proximity is so important for developing the relationships and the social capital that's needed to take forward those types of dynamics. So there's kind of a spectrum, I guess, between the kind of softer cooperative-based policies and then the harder regulatory or tax-oriented policies. But regions can move within that spectrum depending on the competences and policies that they have. And I guess the key is to develop mechanisms that enable a coordination where you have a policy at national level, for example, that has a particular impact on the directionality that you at regional level are looking to take. Then there needs to be an open dialogue in some sense between policymakers at regional level and at national level to try and understand and ensure that the policies are not contradicting one another or moving in the same direction. So I think on the one hand, there is a scale of activities, but it's very difficult to pin right down. It depends on the context. But the key argument really is how you open up the channels of governance. In the Basque Country, we also see that within the region, because, as I say, the tax collecting capacities are at the sub-regional level here at Provincial Council. And one of the big challenges that we have in that context is the continual dialogue between the provincial councils and the regional government and the local municipalities. And it's not a straightforward conversation for sure. We've certainly detected cases where there has been discoordination across different policies, and others where there's been very good coordination. If we look at the Mobile example, for example, the sustainable mobility example, there we see a very close coordination. It's led by the provincial council of Gipuzkoa, but in very close coordination with the regional government and with the municipalities. So I think that's a good example of how you can develop vertical governance in that sense. And then the meta governance point from Liliana, I think there I would, what does that look like? Well, I think, I don't have an answer about what that looks like concretely at regional level. Still, I think it's an idea we need to explore. I don't think it's about one all-seeing institution that's able to meta-govern. I actually think it's a distributed capacity. It's something that is distributed across different actors within the region. So it's quite difficult to conceptualize. It's easier to conceptualize if we look at a concrete initiative. So the Net Zero Supercluster, I think, is a great example of this, because here you have SPRI, the Economic Development Agency, plays a meta-governance role clearly there, because it's interacting on the one hand with the two leading energy companies in the region that have their specific agendas in terms of decarbonisation. And they're different agendas. The oil and gas company and the electricity company have very different agendas when it comes to decarbonisation. So there's potential tension there, or there is tension there. So the SPRI plays a kind of meta-governance role there, but then also with the 5 cluster organisations, who themselves are governance organisations, because they bring together membership of between 100 and 200 or 400 different firms, so that they have their own internal governance within the clusters. So I think there you can see the role that how it's articulated in the scale of a specific mission amongst a specific number of institutions. And then the other question was about other regions. And again, it's a difficult question because aware that the region that I'm most used to studying has a very concrete and well-established set of institutions that have emerged and evolved over time. But I think all regions have their sets of institutions and their sets of strengths in an institutional sense, and the key is building from that. So I think that there are things that that can be learnt again from specific initiatives. Perhaps looking down at the initiative level is again better here than thinking about this in terms of setting up a whole regional governance structure. But if you look at something like the Nobel case or the BlueSky for the Talent case, BlueSky for the Talent is perhaps the most interesting here because it's a relatively new initiative that was set up from scratch about 3 years ago, and is in its very early stages. It's set up because there was an acknowledgement both at the public sector and the private sector that we have a real talent shortage, and that's only going to get worse. And so the governance structure that was set up was an attempt to bring together those different interests and initiate initiatives that could tackle different parts of that challenge under kind of meta-governance structure. So it wasn't something that was here as you say, it started from scratch 3 years ago. So I think that you can build those types of initiatives in any region with the right understanding and with the right kind of motivation to do so at the beginning, and reason why.
Okay, thank you, James. We have also a question from Mads Brun.
Yes, thank you. And James, thank you for a very enlightening presentation. I'm coming from the University of Southern Denmark, and in Denmark we have 4 innomissions. They are organized at the national level, and we are a country of 6 million. So perhaps to some countries that would be a region. But my question relates to some of the reflections you had in your presentation about what is the appropriate level, what's the appropriate place, and due to our observations, if you only focus on the regional level, you have a lack of scale, or at least an opportunity for a lack of scale. But if you focus on the national level, as we do in Denmark, you often lack the proximity, the cognitive, the social, the physical proximity. So my question to you, James, would be those intermediaries that should help link those different levels together. Which kind of competencies should they possess, and how should they try to link those 2 levels together?
I think that's a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer, but I think you're absolutely right. There's certainly a trade-off between scale and between proximity in that sense. And I think this is the European problem in a way. If we look at, I think that look at the Basque Country or Spain or whatever, but this is an EU problem. And if we compare Europe with North America or with Asia, part of the gap in our productivity and competitiveness stems precisely because we don't have the huge scale that those other parts of the world are able to generate in specific industries. We have a very distributed capacities across regions in different places. But that's the reality I think that we have in Europe, and I don't think we've found the key of best. We still haven't yet found the key to best working from that reality. And as I say, it's a European problem. I think interregional collaboration, or intercluster collaboration across regions is a really promising an important mechanism for building scale in a distributed way. Because I don't think we can try or should try to mimic the kind of economic dynamics of Asia or the economic dynamics of North America. I think we're onto a losing course there. What we need to do is build from the regional strengths that we have, but find ways of connecting them in ways that give a greater scale to things. And I would urge that shouldn't necessarily follow a national a national pattern. It's not necessarily within Spain that we need a coordination of Spanish regions. There is, to a certain extent, you need coordination of Spanish regions within Spain. But what's really important is that industrial regions or regions that have similar strengths and capabilities within Europe are able to coordinate structures in ways that enable scale to come. So I know there have been European policy attempts to try and address interregional collaboration, but the funding mechanisms or the policy mechanisms haven't yet been successful. I don't think in terms of doing that. So I think it's something we have to keep working on. Maybe it needs more flexibility in European funding and cohesion policy in terms of where you can spend money and in what types of interregional projects, etc. I don't know. Maybe others also have ideas on that, but it's a really difficult one.
Okay. Thanks, James. Do we have any more questions? I see we do have a hand up. Luis Navarro.
Thanks. Hi, James. A pleasure to meet you today and listening to you. I'm from Navarra region in Spain, a region neighbor of the Basque Country, and collaborating with Orkestra in many senses. So, colleagues here, continuing your comment on I mean, the different interregional collaboration and European landscape of policies and comparison with United States or other big blocks of economic blocks, and finding or looking to find our own European model for developing regions. I think I love the slides commenting the changes in directionality of innovation and industrial policies. It's true that the environment, the policy environment is changing fast, and we are at a moment of strong top-down directionality, especially in industrial policy right now. So this idea you commented that on geopolitical uncertainty and the issue of security and resilience, it's challenging right now these discovery processes and smart specialization itself. So place-based policy looks like it needs a fundamental change right now, and in methodologies and the way of understanding how regions can contribute to this bigger European impact, because currently European policies looking at big impact or big scale projects, high impact industries, EU value projects. So at this point is a super top-down directionality, and looks like cohesion policy is in fact facing risk of centralization again at national level. So imagine Denmark 6 million, in Spain almost 50 million people, 6 million, we have regions of 6 million people. The idea of centralizing policies and having less space for regions and resources for place-based discovery processes is challenging and is, I mean, threatening a lot of policymakers in my country at this moment. So I would like you to, I mean, how to connect this, and if you can make some comments on how the importance of orchestrating these different levels, vertical levels, and if we have some examples of good policy level coordination from European, national, and regional levels, because at this moment I think we will need fast a way of coordinating these three levels of at least three levels of policies. Thanks.
Yeah, I share your concern with the kind of turn. The kind of centralization turn. I think the Draghi report was quite influential in pushing an agenda. The regions are hardly mentioned in that report, and I think that there is a kind of imperative driven by the security agenda, but also driven by the competitiveness agenda. It's not just a security agenda, but there's also the discourse around the productivity gap, etc., that is driving, in a sense, a need for European solutions. And I think that it's right to a certain extent. There is a need for European solutions, but those European solutions need to take into account what regions contribute to them. And I guess that challenges the governance at EU level to some extent in terms of the governance structures. But the question, I guess, really is what can individual regions do within that context? I think one of the things I've noticed here in the Basque Country is discourse around the new industrial plan, for example, that was launched last year. There's been a lot of care taken by the regional policymakers here to articulate that plan as a response to Europe's problems. And the Basque contribution to Europe's problems. So it's being certainly in the discourse very much signaled that, you know, we from the Basque Country, we want to contribute to Europe's competitiveness gap. We want to contribute to Europe's security issues. We want to contribute to our climate challenges, and this is how we're going to do it from the Basque Country. And I think that kind of regional, taking regional responsibility for those European challenges is part of the solution. But it's part of the solution that comes from the regions. We also need a solution from at the EU level, at the nation state level, that recognises those contributions, and we need the forms for that to happen. And I think that you know, the Committee of the Regions is a relatively weak structure in terms of providing that. The cohesion policy still plays a critical role, of course, but their challenges around this new discourse. So I don't have a very concrete answer to you, because I share your concern, but I think the answer has to come from regions ourselves, and thinking about what we can do from that proximity context, and thinking about how we can link that to the challenges at the larger scale, whether that be in the Spanish level or the European level.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any more questions or observations? Yeah, I would just add one point there. Beyond the Committee of the Regions, obviously you have the European Parliament formulating its position now on the new national plans, and the Competitiveness Fund as well, which is where this major shift is happening. But also at the Council, there are, at least in some countries, opposition to this centralising direction, which may find some kind of middle ground towards the end of the year. I've got a question on your points about portfolio management and managing mixes of projects, which seems to change the role of government in designing instruments towards steering a wider set of, if you like, micro activities, depending on how you define these portfolios of projects. What specific capacities do you think, is this something you've thought about, do public authorities need to manage these kind of portfolios well? You mentioned academics are very interested in this, in studying this. It's linked to governance, and maybe this ties back to your points about proximity and dialogue. But yeah, can you say something more about this portfolio management?
Yeah, I first of all, I would say I don't think it's necessarily only a problem for government, and we're still thinking about this. I don't have entirely clear how we're conceptualizing this, but for me the key idea is that government clearly plays a role with policies or traditional policy mixes that support different activities. But then there are other types of activities that are perhaps not captured by, or they're not supported by government, but they're still relevant for the direction for the strategy, the direction that the region's taking. So I think it's government's traditional role in terms of understanding policy instruments and designing clever policy mixes remains, for me, very important. But it needs to combine that role with a broader, I guess, understanding of what's happening in the region, what the projects are, what the key projects are, both in terms of technological projects, in terms of economic projects, and in terms of the fusion between them, so that it's able to, first of all, design its policy mix in a more adaptive and clever way to respond to that, but also to bring in the strategies of private actors, etc., into an overall transition pathway. And as I said before, I don't think this is. I think this is actually a distributed capacity within a region. I think that other organisations, non-governmental organisations, also play a key role in this. And cluster organisations, for me, are a very good example. In part, well, I've studied them a lot here in the Basque Country. They're very influential here. In the industry plan that the Basque government has set up, for example, the cluster organisations take on a specifically important role in terms of the transformative projects. If a company or group of companies, it has to be a group of companies rather than individual company or research centres or universities, want to propose a transformative project, they need to do so through a cluster organisation. That was a mechanism that was set up to try and, if you like, distribute. So it's not simply government that's taken this coordinating role, but it's a range of other intermediaries that are working in partnership with government around that overall meta governance. So that was a bit of a rambling answer, Carlos, but because we're still thinking about exactly how to conceptualize this. But I don't think it's a question of government only. That's I think my main point.
Yeah, no, that was an interesting response. It also makes me think that the Basque case has a dense, as you said, institutional network of governance actors. You mentioned SPRI, the agency, the business and innovation agency, the clusters, of course, and many actors. I mean, you shared that photo as well of the new industrial policy actors, and the Basque Country is known for having a strong network of research and innovation actors. But does that not also present a challenge, a coordination challenge, because it's dense? I think you mentioned the issue of provinces and financing between the sub-regional and the regional level as well. But it must be very challenging to coordinate all these institutions and networks within the country, the Basque Country.
Oh, it is. Yeah, it is challenging. And there's always the question of to what extent, and this is a question that comes up that is constantly being asked here and by people who come and visit the Basque Country as well, is to what extent is there duplication, is there inefficiency from having so many institutions and having to coordinate them. My sense from coming up originally from a UK context and spending the last 20 years working here is that yes, there are challenges and there are tensions, but the benefits to me outweigh the costs in the sense of continually pushing a reflexive process. It's kind of almost like a competition also amongst different actors, and that tends to push up the level of reflexivity and the level of strategic thought around policy processes. But in order to do that, you have to take care of the governance and coordination. So.
Okay, thanks, James. We've just gone over the hour, so let me just conclude by thanking you, James, and also to everyone else for your interest in today's webinar. As I said, this concludes our spring series, and we'll take a break till the autumn series starting in September. We'll continue to publicise the webinars through EPRC's LinkedIn page and the email list. If you're not on it, please just email Marina from the registration for today's webinar. And we hope to see you again soon. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.